One day, two members of the firm picked Whittaker up. He owed them money and they were angry. Kevin Whittaker was in serious trouble.
In the summer of 1994, as Darren Nichols was struggling to stay on the straight and narrow, another petty criminal from Essex was also desperately trying to put the past behind him. Kevin Whittaker seemed to be on the right track. He'd managed to kick his long-term cocaine habit. He was holding down a steady, well-paid job that he really enjoyed. He had given up drug dealing, and his beloved long-term girlfriend Alison was expecting the couple's first child. It was the kind of life that few would have predicted for the former tearaway, whose first brush with the law had come a decade earlier, at the tender age of 18. He and two friends, Mark Phillips and Alan Venner, drunk on a mixture of cheap lager and Pernod, had broken into the Kingswood Junior School in Basildon and started playing around with some matches. The handful of small fires that set took hold rapidly, and within minutes 2 classrooms were completely ablaze. Nearly £100,000 worth of damage had been done. Whittaker and his friends were seen running away from the school and were arrested a few days later. When it came to court, Phillips and Venner were convicted of arson and sentenced to 18 months each. Whittaker was acquitted, but was sentenced to 9 months youth custody for his part in a series of burglaries that came to light as a result of the investigation. After his release, Whittaker went back to living with his parents, Albert and Joan, who encouraged him to find work and to try and sort his life out. He went through a succession of menial jobs, none of which lasted more than a few weeks, and ended up spending most of his time on the dole. Despite this, he never seemed particularly short of cash or company. His friends would come round all the time, and they would all have mobile phones and expensive cars, but none of them were working, says Albert. Kevin had also started smoking cannabis, almost all the time. I told him I didn't want it in the house, but he just carried on regardless. Sometimes he would disappear for a few days at a time, and then there were times we would get phone calls in the middle of the night. They seemed really desperate to get hold of Kevin, but they'd only ever leave their first names, no numbers. At the back of my mind, I suspected he was involved in drug dealing, but there didn't seem to be anything we could do. According to one of his school friends, Simon Smith, Whittaker had started dabbling in drug dealing soon after being released from prison. He started out selling tiny amounts of cannabis strictly to his friends, slowly built up the scale of his business until he was trading whole ounces at a time to everyone and making enough money out of it and the dole to be quite comfortable off. By the early 90s, Whittaker's drug dealing operation would have been turning a tiny profit, had it not been for the fact that most of his earnings were disappearing straight up his nose. The first time I saw Kevin snort cocaine was at a party in Southend in 1992, says Smith. A few days later, he confided in me that he was a cocaine addict, but he was confident that he would be able to control it. But from what I could see, it was just getting worse and worse. Whittaker had many sources for his drugs, but the one he favoured most was a certain Craig Rolfe, an arrogant, stocky young man who seemed determined to make a name for himself in the Essex underworld. I met Craig about half a dozen times in all, and immediately formed the opinion that I didn't really like him, says Simon Smith. And maybe that was a bit quiet around people, I don't know, but for some reason I just couldn't click with him. He hadn't done anything wrong, it was just my instinct telling me not to trust him. That Craig Rolfe would end up pursuing a life of crime was inevitable as night following day. He was born on the 7th of June 1969 in the hospital unit of Holloway Prison, where his mother Lorraine was serving 18 months for making false statements. The attractive 23-year-old had been having a passionate affair with 19-year-old John Kennedy behind the back of a market trader husband Brian Rolfe for the best part of 2 years. Just before Christmas 1967, the pair had eloped to Birmingham. But within a few weeks, Lorraine discovered she was expecting Rolfe's child and opted to return to her husband rather than stay with the jobless Kennedy. The affair continued, however, and over the months that followed, Kennedy became increasingly frustrated at Lorraine's refusal to end her marriage. In the small hours of Christmas Eve 1968, he decided he had had enough. He broke into the couple's house, crept up to the main bedroom, and as Brian lay asleep next to his wife, smashed his skull to pieces with 3 hefty blows from a bowling alley skittle. Lorraine awoke to the horrific scene to find Kennedy kneeling beside her. "I've done this to prove how much I love you," he said before dragging the body from the marital bed and dumping it in a van at the side of the road to make it look like a bungled robbery. Just days after the brutal killing, Lorraine, by then a mother of 3, discovered that Rolfe had got her pregnant once more. It didn't take police long to crack the case, and within a few days both she and Kennedy were arrested and charged with murder. The following March, Kennedy was sentenced to life. Lorraine, who broke down sobbing in court as her lover was sent down, was cleared of murder and convicted of lying to the police to throw them off Kennedy's scent. "I've done nothing," she screamed as she was led down to the cells. With skeletons like those in his closet, it's no surprise that the young Craig Rolfe turned out to be a difficult child. He had precious little time for rules and regulations, and even less time for the classroom. For him, school was just a place where you got into fights and met up with your friends. Studying for exams was something that only idiots did. By the age of 16, Rolfe would become a classic juvenile delinquent, rebelling against pretty much everything that society had to offer, and picking up a few minor convictions along the way. He worked briefly as a tyre fitter, then as a plasterer, but the only thing he ever truly applied himself to was the study of drugs, happy sampling whatever he could lay his hands on. It was around that time that Rolfe started dating Donna Jaggers, a local girl with a handful of convictions for shoplifting and cheque fraud. Eager to impress the new lady in his life, Rolfe began selling drugs in nightclubs around Basildon. The relationship was turbulent to say the least, but no matter how much they argued and fought, somehow the pair found they couldn't live without each other. Just a few months after they began going out, Donna was horrified to discover that she was pregnant. She booked herself into an abortion clinic, but Rolfe, fantastically close to his mother and desperate for a child of his own, persuaded her to see it through with a promise that he would look after them all. Rolfe was never going to be a criminal mastermind, but it didn't take long for him to realise that although selling drugs was a profitable part-time business, buying them was too much like hard work and something of a mug's game. If you needed some gear, all you had to do was find someone to strike a deal with and then rip them off. Powerfully built and absolutely fearless, Rolfe excelled at the task. Craig and Donna's daughter was born in the autumn of 1990. A few weeks later, Craig made a drug sale that was to dictate the path the rest of his life was to follow. A long dark-haired man turned up at Rolfe's house, having been told by friends there was some good quality cocaine available. As is the custom, a small test supply was arranged. "This is good gear. Where does it come from?" asked the man. Rolfe, high on his own supply, saw no reason to hide the truth. "Dunno, nicked it off some pikey fucker down on the coast." The man was Tony Tucker, another up-and-coming face in the Essex underworld. After getting out of the army in the late 80s, Tucker had worked briefly as a carpenter before starting up a small firm supplying doormen for clubs and bars. At the time, Tucker was a small-time businessman with criminal learnings. He lived in a modest two-bedroom house, drove a second-hand Granada, and occasionally made a little money on the side. A keen bodybuilder, Tucker recruited staff for his doorman firm from gyms across the county to make sure they looked the part as much as he did himself. Tucker's timing was perfect. The second summer of love was in full swing, and acid house parties and outdoor raves were all the rage. The demand for doormen grew, and the security business quickly became Tucker's sole source of income. These burly lads were also in demand as debt collectors, and it didn't take Tucker long to realise that, even if there was no debt, big blokes with a lot of front could still collect money. One of his earliest scams involved some stables near Basildon, where he kept his horses. He sent in a group of heavies into the bar of the riding school, where they proceeded to smash the place to pieces and threaten the staff. The next day, a concerned Tucker went to see the owner. He earnestly explained that he had heard about the trouble on the grapevine and had a good idea who was involved. Through his contacts in his firm, he could ensure the men never came back. And all he would ask in return was that he could stable his horses for free for the rest of his life. Like Rolfe, Tucker also liked to rip off drug dealers. He would slowly gain someone's confidence and then explain that through his connections in the club scene, he would be able to shift a large amount of drugs. The idea would be to give the dealer the impression that Tucker had never done anything like it before, that he was simply doing them a favour. The last thing they'd ever expect is that he was about to stitch them up. Having acquired the drugs, Tucker would then disappear to meet with a buyer. He returned a little later looking shell-shocked, saying the police had raided the meeting place. He'd been forced to dump the drugs and run for it. There isn't much etiquette in the drug world, but one accepted protocol is that if you are the courier, the go-between in the drugs deal, and it all comes on top, then it's down to you to repay the debt. Tucker was only too aware of this and fronted them out. He got away with it every time. Few people were brave enough to argue. To take on Tucker was to take on his entire firm. When Tucker met Rolfe, he immediately recognised a kindred spirit and took him under his wing. At the time of the meeting, Rolfe was 21 and Tucker was 33. For Rolfe, Tucker was the father figure he'd always craved. What made it even better was the fact that Tucker was living the life that he was himself aiming for. Tucker drove either a black Porsche with the number plate TT9 or his brand new Jaguar. He had a large, nicely decorated house in Diamond Close, Chafford 100, and had a wardrobe to die for. He even had enough cash to buy his then wife a Porsche 924. Rolf was particularly impressed with the fact that Tucker hung around with the celebrity set. He was the personal minded too, and a close friend of the boxer Nigel Benn, having been at the ringside for many of his fights. Rolf's personal cocaine habit was become ruinously expensive, and hanging around with Tucker meant there was near constant supply for free. Tucker benefited too. Rolf was a devoted, willing and reliable general, happy to run around and do every mundane errand that was put before him. Then there was the admiration. So far as Rolf was concerned, Tucker was the best bloke in the world ever. He made sure that everyone he met knew it. If it ever came up on top, Tucker knew that Rolf would do absolutely everything he could to protect him. He would literally take a bullet for him. And in the world that Tucker was moving in, it never hurt to have someone like that around. It was a match made in heaven. Over the next couple of years, Tucker's business grew to the point that he was turning over $5,000 each week just from providing doormen. His earnings soared even higher once the younger and more streetwise Rolf turned him onto the idea of cashing in on the rapid growth of the club's drug scene. Controlling the doors of a club instantly means you control who sells drugs inside. Tucker began to charge dealers rent of around £1,000 a week in return for granting them exclusive access to his club. Rolf was rewarded with what he considered to be the perfect job, one that gave him credibility at the bank and allowed him to apply for a mortgage, but one that he never had to turn up at the office. In fact, he didn't have to do anything at all. The job, a director of Tucker's security company with a salary of $30,000 per year, existed only on paper, but to Rolf it was worth its weight in gold. Although Rolf had no active role in the day-to-day business, he was clearly involved in helping Tucker keep other employers in check. The reputation of both men was usually enough to ensure that those they employed behaved themselves. On the few occasions that somebody was stupid enough to step out of line, the pair ensured the matter was dealt with ruthlessly so to discourage others from doing the same. One such punishment beating was caught on a CCTV camera, trained in on the car park of an Essex pub. The grainy black and white footage shows Tucker and Rolf hauling the man out of the exit, pushing him hard against the wall. They poke him hard in the chest as the accusations fly, slapping him in the face to encourage him to answer. The petrified victim doesn't know which way to look or what to say, but then the first punch comes. He crumbles to the ground and rolls about, clenching his face in agony. The pain grows more intense as the kicks follow, thick and fast. Then Tucker backs off, breathing hard with the exertion. Rolf leans forward and picks the man up, propping him against the wall so that Tucker can hit him some more. There are punches to his head, kicks to the groin, elbows, knees and headbutts until the man finally collapses, unconscious and senseless. Only then do the pair walk away, safe in the knowledge that no matter who might have seen them, no one would dare speak out against them. Another film shows Rolf slapping lightly across the face someone who then collapses in a pool of blood. In fact, the man had been slashed around the face with a Stanley knife. In July 1994, the final part of the jigsaw that would transform Tucker and Rolf into an unstoppable force, Pat Tate, was released on parole. Tate was immediately installed into the business and took charge of acquiring yet more drugs for distribution throughout the pubs and clubs under Tucker's control. Any criminal worth his salt knows that being banged up in prison is no excuse for dropping out of the game. And so it was that Pat Tate had continued to organise highly professional drug shipments by phone whilst being held in cells in numerous prisons up and down the county. That, combined with the contacts he'd made while serving time, made him a valuable member of the team. Ripping off dealers was fine for acquiring small amounts, an ounce there, a half kilo here, but the smart money bought the stuff in bulk from reliable sources. With Tate on board, the price of the ecstasy, cocaine and speed that Tucker was able to buy dropped dramatically. Profits from trading in the club soared, and the gang even began re-exporting drugs to the holiday market in Tenerife and Ibiza. Tucker, Tate and Rolf were on their way to dominating the club's drug scene across Essex. Around the time that Whittaker started dealing with Craig Rolf, he also started up a relationship with Alison Pinkton. The relationship lasted several months, then the pair broke up. But after a few months they decided to get back together again. Kevin told me that him and Alison were getting engaged, and they had set up a home together in Brackley Crescent, Pitsea, says Smith. It took me completely by surprise as I wasn't even aware they were back together. A few weeks after that, in late 1993, Kevin told me that Alison was pregnant and due to have a baby the following June. He told me that he'd managed to stop taking cocaine altogether because he wanted to be a good father. Whittaker had also found paid work laying crazy paving with a man named Ronnie, and for the first time in his life he seemed to be generally stable. His parents noticed he was working hard, looking after himself, and saving to prepare for the birth of his son. They were pleased he had finally turned over a new leaf, but then disaster struck. Around April 1994, Whittaker and Ronnie had had a huge argument, and he suddenly found himself unemployed and with a baby due in only a few weeks. Desperate for cash to make ends meet, the temptation to go back to his old ways was simply too powerful to resist. Whittaker approached Rolf, who offered him the chance to be a courier in a cannabis deal that he was putting together with the backing of Tucker and Tate. Whittaker's job was to collect the drugs from a firm in Manchester and then bring them back to London. But when the drugs arrived, there was a kilo missing. As Whittaker was the courier, the debt was down to him. He pleaded that the Manchester firm must have made a mistake with the amount, that they were probably trying to rip Rolf and the others off. But Rolf wouldn't hear of it. The debt was down to him, and it had to be repaid. Whittaker knew only too well what Tucker and Rolf were capable of. He suspected that he himself might have been the victim of a setup, that Rolf was just trying it on to line his own pockets, but he could never prove it, and he knew unless he got the money to pay the gang back, his life wouldn't be worth living. Towards the end of September 1994, Kevin Whittaker turned up out of the blue at his mother's workplace. He said, "Please can you help me?" Joan recalls. I said, "In what way?" He said he needed some money to get him out of trouble. I said, "What sort of trouble?" He said, "I can't tell you. I will one day, but I can't at the moment." I told him he'd have to come home and talk to me and his dad about it. Albert takes up the story. He sat us down. He was white as a sheet. You could see it in his eyes. He was very, very frightened. He explained that he desperately needed £2,500. He said he owed the money for drugs. He said, "I've been a fool. I need to finish with it and get out the drugs business, and this is the way to do it." He said that if he did not get the money, he would kill himself, that he would jump off the multi-storey car park or something. He appeared nervy and in trouble. I've never seen him in such a state. He'd never talked about committing suicide before, so we knew he was genuinely worried. It was a bad time for us. We were off on holiday to the Far East a few days later, but I decided to help Kevin in the hope that he would come to his senses, and it would be the end of it. On the 30th of September 1994, Albert made a cheque out from his Woolworth Building Society, amount for £2,000. Kevin had instructed his parents to make the cheque out not to him, but to Russell Tate, the younger brother of Pat. At the same time they handed over the cheque, Joan gave her son £500 in cash. The following day, Albert and Joan left for their holiday. They returned 3 weeks later to discover that Kellen and Alison had split up, and their son was now living with his friend, Simon Smith. Kevin ended up sleeping on a settee in my lounge, says Smith. He never confided to me the root of the problems between him and Alison, but he was clearly very upset by the whole incident. He wasn't taking much care of himself as far as personal hygiene was concerned. He never had a bath at my home, and he wasn't washing at all. The fact that he wasn't taking much pride with his appearance was out of character, but he was a clean, meticulous person. He was even sleeping every night fully clothed. He was obviously pretty down about things. On the morning of the Wednesday the 16th of November, Whittaker was preparing to leave Simon's house. I asked him if he wanted a lift to somewhere, and he said, "No, I'm meeting someone," and walked off towards Rectory Road. A little later, whilst driving his car, Smith parts a Vauxhall Corsa being driven by Craig Rolfe and spotted Whittaker in the passenger seat. I got home around 4 in the afternoon and found Kevin asleep on the settee. He woke up and we spoke about what he'd been up to that day. He explained that he and Craig were involved in a drugs deal. He said that he was getting something, Craig was getting something, that it was going to be put together to give to the same person. Kevin said that he was getting cannabis but didn't say what Craig was getting. I asked him if it was a good earner, and he said he was going to make a few grand. The following morning, Smith gave Whittaker a lift to his parents' house. Having got back from holiday, they had taken charge of the situation and arranged for Alison to bring their grandson to their house each afternoon from Thursday to Monday, so that their son could have access. Alison turned up a little later, and Whittaker spent the afternoon playing with his son and taking a few phone calls, including one from Simon Smith. I planned to see Kevin and the baby that afternoon, says Smith. We spoke on the phone late afternoon and he said he was waiting for a call from Craig and then planned to meet up with him. I asked if everything was alright and he said, "Yeah, I'll talk to you when I get back." When I turned up at his parents' house, they said I'd just missed him. I never saw him again. As the evening drew on, Albert and Joan became increasingly concerned about their son. Whenever he left them with the baby, he would always call every hour or so to check everything was okay. This was the first time he had not done so. Kevin had seemed fine when he went out, says Albert. He did not seem depressed or anything. The split up with Alison had upset him, but he seemed to be alright. There had been times in the week since the breakup that Kevin had been down. but he had not mentioned ended it or seemed particularly stressed since he'd asked for the money. Nearly 30 hours after he left home, Albert and Joan's worst fears were realised at 10 p.m. on Friday evening when Detective Sharp and Detective Constable Mayo arrived at the house and asked whether the two of them would be able to travel to the mortuary at Basildon Hospital to assist in an identification. The body of Kevin Whittaker had been found face down in a ditch at the side of Dunton Road, Dunton, surrounded by a few odd bags of rubbish. There were no signs of violence, no obvious cause of death, until a closer examination revealed 5 puncture marks in his right forearm and elbow. A toxicology report from the Aldermaston laboratory found that Whittaker had cocaine, ecstasy and ketamine and lignocaine in his body stream. Each drug was present in high enough concentration to have caused death on its own. Police began interviewing Whittaker's friends and family to piece together his movements up until the time that his body was found. It was only a matter of days before Craig Rolfe was arrested. On December the 1st, 1994, he made the following statement at Basildon Police Station. I met Whittaker at a friend's flat 5 years earlier. Over the 5 years, I got to know Kevin fairly well. Having said that, we're not particularly close, although I've done him a few favours in the past. We've only gone out socially together on one occasion, and on average I would see him 2 or 3 times a month. The last time was on Tuesday the 15th of November, around the mid-afternoon, when I saw him standing in a telephone kiosk in Rectory Road, Pitsea, making a telephone call. I stopped the car I was driving, a blue Vauxhall Corsa, and had a conversation for approximately 10 to 15 minutes. I then drove off and left him to walk to Simon Smith's house. The last time I spoke to him was between 3 or 4 on Thursday the 17th, when I phoned him from my home address to his father's address. The conversation lasted 5 minutes, and I can recall that he said he had been to see his little boy that morning. At no time did he mention that he was worried about anything, or that he had any problems, other than the fact he was a bit down having split with his girlfriend. That evening I went out to friends. I received a call on Saturday afternoon saying Kevin was dead. Rolfe's statement was supported by his girlfriend Donna Jaggers, who testified that he was with her on the night and at the time that Kevin was thought to have died. The two of them had stayed in to watch a video. Nothing out of the ordinary had happened. It was just a quiet evening in. Once the police had finished gathering their evidence, the most likely explanation, it seemed, was that Kevin accidentally overdosed. He had probably died at the home of a friend who, terrified at being implicated, had dumped the body in a ditch. But for Kevin's parents and his close friends, that simply didn't add up. For one thing, Kevin had an absolute fear of needles. A few years earlier he had been bitten by a dog and his family tried to take him to hospital for a tetanus injection. It kicked up such a fuss that they eventually agreed to drop the idea. Then there was the fact that the puncture marks were on Kevin's right arm. Kevin was right-handed. For him to inject himself in such a spot would be physically impossible. There's no way my son died by accident, says Albert Whittaker. It was murder. It would take nearly 2 years for the truth to emerge. Having narrowly escaped to good hiding over the missing cannabis fiasco, Whittaker had been wary of dealing for Craig & Co again. But when in November 1994 they offered him the chance of coming in on another deal, it was too good an opportunity to miss. A buyer had come to Rolfe asking for 25 kilos of cannabis, worth around £60,000. Rolfe didn't have access to that much straight away, but didn't want to lose the deal, so he stalled while calling around everyone he knew in order to put the stashes together to make the full amount. Whittaker knew where he could get hold of a large amount of cannabis on short-term credit and at a discount for buying in bulk, and realised that this was his chance to make some proper money for once. Based on his contribution, he should have made at least £5,000, but once the deal was in place he was told he was only going to be paid £2,000, barely enough to cover the cost of the drugs themselves, and leaving him with no profit at all. It was then that Whittaker made the biggest mistake of his life. He complained. Rolfe promised to sort it out, and after discussing the situation with Tucker, called Whittaker on the Thursday to invite him over to his house on the pretext of wanting to arrange another deal to boost Whittaker's profits. At first it all seemed plausible enough. Whittaker arrived to find Rolfe, Tucker and Rolfe's girlfriend in the front room drinking. He was offered a beer and sat down to join the conversation. But as he drank he began to feel a little woozy, and then he found he could no longer stand properly or see clearly. By the time he realised his drink had been spiked, it was too late. Tucker had always suspected Whittaker of stealing the missing kilo of drugs. It was he who led the inquisition. Like drugs, do ya? Well, here, have some more. Here, have all the drugs you want. Whittaker was held down and injected time and time again with Special K, ketamine and cocaine, while being bombarded with questions about his suppliers. He finally slipped into unconsciousness, and his limp body was taken through the interior door to the garage where a Vauxhall Corsa had been hired especially for the task. He was driven to Dunton, where his body was dumped. The car was valeted twice before being returned to the hire company. None of this was known when the inquest into Kevin Whittaker's death was held in January 1995 at Chelmsford Coroner's Court. Detective Inspector Peter Hamilton explained that the police had investigated a suggestion of murder connected with a drugs deal, but had found no evidence. The file had been closed. The court also heard evidence from Craig Rolfe, who turned up with Tony Tucker. He repeated what he'd said in his statement and took the case no further. The coroner, Dr. Malcolm Weir, had no option but to support the police line on the death, that the 28-year-old had all but taken his own life. Depressed about the split from his girlfriend and the loss of his job, he had started to inject hard drugs but had accidentally overdosed. After the inquest, Rolfe and Tucker and a few friends celebrated with a night on the town. No one could deny they were on the up and up. No one could deny that they had ascended to new heights of criminality and they were joining the ranks of the elite. The two of them had literally got away with murder.